I just don't think it likely. They've suffered a lot themselves, huge manpower losses, economy really teetering on the brink, and they're not in a position now to suddenly roll across Ukraine.
Hugo Rifkin here on Times Radio, and the Times' Michael Binyon is here to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Michael. Welcome back.
Hello, Hugo.
Good to have you with us. Look, it's difficult to know exactly where to start this morning, but I think we should begin with Zelensky's relationship with Trump that we've been talking about so much. Zelensky has said his bust-up with Trump will pass, but he doesn't appear to want to apologise for what happened in the Oval Office on Friday or feel it's his place to do so. Michael, you've been a diplomatic correspondent since I was reading Jemima Puddleduck, if not before. Have you ever seen anything like what happened on Friday?
No, certainly not, and certainly not in America. I mean, we've seen notable bust-ups in, other places, but nothing with the American president losing his cool in front of the world's press, and nothing where it had such a catastrophic effect on Western unity, really, on the foundations of NATO, which has been going since 1949.
Does it work to anyone's advantage? Is there an upside here?
There's an upside to Trump because, A, it goes down quite well with most of his supporters. They feel he's showing a bit of muscle. He's telling the world, we're not going to be bossed about by anybody. And B, he really does have it in for Zelensky, and he got his own back he got it back in spades. And I'm afraid poor old Zelensky was made to look pretty, isolated and pathetic.
But then the fact that he followed up the next day with this huge embrace from European leaders, within 24 hours, 48 hours at least, he was meeting the king. He was being hugged by Keir Starmer. Emmanuel Macron couldn't keep his hands off him. Does that sort of strengthen his position? Do you think that'll make any difference in Washington at all?
It doesn't make much difference. In fact, it might make it slightly worse because Trump would see this as a provocation by the Americans, who are basically questioning
by the Europeans,
leadership. Sorry, provocation by the Europeans. I mean, yes, exactly. Questioning American leadership, and that would be a red rag to a bull. But I think, to some extent, the Europeans also played it quite carefully. Of course, there's the picture of them all together and them all embracing Zelensky. That's important. But also, they came out with statements that were sensible, moderate. There was no outright condemnation of Trump in any way, hopeful that some bridge could be restored. And I think Keir Starmer handled it pretty well. He came out as a statesman, and the others paid tribute to his leadership at that conference.
I mean, we'll come to Starmer in a moment. For Zelensky, Republicans in the United States have called for him to step aside as leader. Zelensky said he'll do that in exchange for NATO membership, which is, of course, sort of likely to be a non-starter. Trump has ruled that out as well. What do you think Zelensky can and should do now? Is he going to have to try and make good with Trump, or can you see them just rubbing along? Do you think he's doomed? What do you reckon?
I think his position is very difficult anyway. I think even if there hadn't been this bust-up with Trump, there would have probably come a time when he felt he needs to step aside, partly because if there is going to be some kind of deal, the man who was the heroic war leader, everything he's hoped for and stood for would probably be undermined. A deal certainly won't bring back the territory that Ukraine has lost to Russia. And I think he may feel that his time as a war leader is over and it's time for somebody else to step in. I mean, that would be the honourable thing to do. I think he would have to resign under Ukrainian pressure as well as under outside pressure. Now, to resign because Trump has lost faith in him, well, that's more difficult. That really is sort of the whole country losing face vis-a-vis America. If he can sign this deal on the minerals, which seems quite honestly an extraordinary deal, and I mean, that would mortgage Ukraine's wealth and future for many years to come. I mean, it's not a good deal for Ukraine. But if he had to sign that, then maybe he could get away with trying to say, now I've steered things back into calmer waters. I think it's a difficult time for him, whatever happens.
I mean, but if you look at where he was going into the Oval Office, there's a level in which you can ask, well, look, what's he got to lose, right? Because he's being pressured to sign, as you say, this minerals deal that is sort of economically disempowering for Ukraine, perhaps for a generation, and even to get to that stage, it seems pretty likely that any kind of peace that Trump was talking about would involve giving up Crimea, which has sort of become what this war's all about anyway.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think it's very few people realistically think that Crimea will go back to Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, after all, it is mostly populated by Russian speakers. It has historically always been Russian. It was only a quirk of Khrushchev's administration that they turned over control of Crimea in 1954 to Ukraine rather than from Russia. So I think that's a bit of a lost cause. I mean, I know they feel very strongly about it, and it was basically seized by these little men in green in 2014. But
In
I
their
think
balaclavas, yeah.
yeah, that one's a lost cause. And I think the Ukrainians are beginning to think, well, you know, it's time to just stop because we're not going to get anything back. And we don't want to continue losing so many people on the Eastern Front.
Well, so the UK's ambassador to the US, our old friend Peter Mandelson, spoke to ABC yesterday and suggested that Zelensky ought to agree a ceasefire on Trump's terms. Let's have a listen.
The reset has to consist of the United States and Ukraine getting back on the same page, and President Zelensky giving his unequivocal backing to the initiative that President Trump is taking to end the war and to bring a just and lasting peace. And by the way, I think that Ukraine should be the first to commit to a ceasefire and defy the Russians to follow.
Well, so the government's Armed Forces Minister Luke Pollard told Sky News this morning that Mandelson's remarks don't reflect government policy. But Mandelson's logic is that if Trump has economic interest in Ukraine, this mineral deal, if it does happen, however disadvantageous to Ukraine it is, then that will de facto guarantee Ukraine's security because there are American interests there on the ground. Do you think that the way forward is going to be Zelensky having to sign this deal or something like it?
Well, he probably will have to sign it. I think there's going to be this historic, whether one welcomes it or not, meeting between Putin and Trump, where they're going to carve up Europe. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation, but that's going to happen. And whatever the deal, Ukraine will not be very happy. So they've got to find some way around it. I mean, I think Peter Mandelson is playing a smooth and fairly typical role of making sure that, you know, the audience that he's talking to hears what they want to hear. And probably that is the way of keeping Trump basically on side, you know, to butter him up and say the right things, while other forces are there to try to persuade Trump that they do need to offer some kind of guarantee for whatever force is stationed. I mean, the coalition of the willing, as it were.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually think that thing isn't quite as vital as everybody says, because I don't think if a deal is signed, the Russians are not going to invade in the next week or year or even 4 years. I just don't think it likely. They've suffered a lot themselves, huge manpower losses, economy really teetering on the brink. And they're not in a position now to suddenly roll across Ukraine. America would come to the Allies' help if the British or French troops started being killed in numbers. Even without American air support, they would be forced to intervene at some point. And also, Trump would see that as an absolute violation of the deal he'd made with Putin. So I don't think that's likely. So I think that it is perfectly possible to station a small force, a sort of token tripwire, and that would probably play a psychological part, if not a very important military role. So I think there is a way forward for doing that. And I think, you know, all sides have got to get used to the idea that this deal is going to happen, and Trump is determined to make it happen.
But I mean, see, that's fascinating in itself, the idea that this deal is going to happen, because it seems to me that there is no deal. And so what's confusing me about the coalition of the willing stuff is we seem to be putting the pieces in order for peacekeeping post-deal when no one's seen what the deal is. No one's that confident there's going to even be one. And it seems to be that what America wants, even what America wants and what Russia wants, never mind what Ukraine wants and what Russia wants, are completely incompatible.
Well, yes, they are.
Yeah.
That's where diplomacy comes in, to try to square the circle, try to make things work, even if they don't work. I mean, that's been the point of, I mean, just look at the Middle East, which I think we'll talk about soon. The same thing, you know, people with different demands and different ideas trying to make something not just end in an explosion. I think there will be a deal, and we sort of know the outlines of it. Russia will get roughly what it wants. It will keep the territory it's got. Ukraine won't join NATO. I think that's unlikely in any case, whatever the deal with Russia. They won't join NATO. There will be some kind of security guarantee for Ukraine, but we just have to wait and see how Putin plays it. But Putin, you see, he's got another other thing, it's not just Ukraine, it's getting Russia out of the pariah status. And if he can sweet-talk the Americans, which may mean some concessions on his part, not many, but some, then maybe a Western trade will come back to Russia, and they do need that. I mean, there are American companies already sniffing at the opportunity of going back into Russia and doing some business. And that's partly what Putin, that's one of his main aims of this whole meeting, that it's not just Ukraine, it's America-Russia relations is what's important for him.
And also it could turn the gas back on for Europe, which is a sort of a massively big deal for Germany and everywhere else as well. Finally, just before we go to the Middle East, do you foresee a new era of European defence power? A lot of people have been quoting Donald Tusk and his point that, what was it, 500 million Europeans shouldn't have to rely on 300 million Americans to defend them from 150 million Russians. And this idea of sort of European might, European force, Europe being able to stand on its own 2 feet and not have to worry about Russia, even without American help. Is that going to change things?
Not much. I mean, Europeans will up their spending, but the idea of a unified European army, a single European command, and who's going to lead it? Who's going to command it? Would Spain be happy to be just playing a small role beneath Britain, France, and possibly Germany? I mean, each country still has its national interests, and the pooling resources, and indeed pooling procurement resources, which is a big economic factor for many countries, that seems to me fairly unlikely. I mean, they will try, and of course they will integrate what they can. They will consult each other, but the idea of a single European force ready to take on any comers, I think that's just not going to happen.
Well, let's turn to the Middle East while I've got you, because it's understood that Hamas is going to reject an Israeli request to extend the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire agreement. And in response, Israel has blocked the entry of all humanitarian aid into Gaza in the meantime. We're supposed to have moved on to phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement. Why does Israel want to extend phase 1?
Well, because Israel doesn't want to move to phase 2. I mean, that's
a good answer, Michael. Yeah.
Involves negotiating the future of Gaza. It involves some kind of plan whereby the Israeli forces withdraw, and it's turned over, well, one hopes not to Hamas, but to some kind of Palestinian administration or even international administration. It won't be Riviera on the Mediterranean, as maybe President Trump has, I think, frankly, not seriously suggested. But that is, whatever it is, Netanyahu knows that that would infuriate his right wing. He still depends on a lot of right-wingers. He's lost 1 or 2 from his cabinet, but he does not want to move to that. He does not want to withdraw from Gaza, and that is what phase 2 entails. So he also knows that releasing the hostages is an absolute priority domestically for many Israelis. The thing is, yes, Hamas should and must release the hostages really straight away, whatever happens. But it's the only leverage Hamas has, in a way, to make sure that the Americans push the plan that they've originally conceived, or at least more or less proposed and implemented in the Middle East. And I think it is important that they move to phase 2. They can't indefinitely postpone it, because basically then Israel simply maintains a permanent occupation of Gaza, and that is no recipe for peace.
I mean, is there an argument that, given that this is the situation that exists at the moment, the fact that Israel sort of rained down all manner of destruction upon Gaza. The death toll has been horrendous. Almost everyone in the world agrees that the death toll has been horrendous, and yet Hamas remains in power. Israel hasn't got all the hostages back. And is there an argument that, I mean, one of the reasons why Israel doesn't want to move on to the next phase is that Israel has essentially not, I wouldn't quite say lost this war, but has certainly not won this war, because it hasn't achieved its aims.
No, the aims were never really realistic, to destroy Hamas completely. The problem is, if you bomb civilian population, it's like sowing dragon's teeth. More and more young people who've lost their entire family will say, I'm absolutely aghast and furious and horrified, and I'm going to join the fighters. I'm going to resist this. So they're recruiting, plenty of young people, and there are, still a lot of young people. Thank God there are a lot of young people still alive in Gaza, and many of them will be attracted to join Hamas or something like it. Hamas as a fighting force has lost a lot of credibility, and a lot of people in Gaza are absolutely furious that Hamas has taken them into this situation. I mean, there is a lot of resentment of Hamas control, but this is a pretty nasty network of people. I mean, they are used to pretty much controlling and terrorizing the population. So to eliminate them was a war aim that Netanyahu had, but frankly, it wasn't realistic. think.
Finally, Michael, Israel has been condemned for closing off humanitarian aid by the likes of Egypt and Jordan, both of which have been very interesting countries to watch lately, because Donald Trump, of course, been pressuring them to get more involved in taking refugees and all that kind of stuff. Is it significant that they've condemned Israel for this?
Well, yes, but they're not alone. I mean, a lot of humanitarian organizations have said that you can't do that. You must not do that. You can't use starvation as a weapon. Now, the Israelis argue that actually so much food has already gone in that no one is starving. But actually, malnutrition over a period of a year has taken its toll. And just cutting off aid indefinitely, that is the one thing for which Netanyahu himself was convicted by the International Criminal Court. I mean, wasn't convicted, but was accused of.
The warrants for, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That it was the use of food as a weapon was seen as unacceptable in any circumstances.
Yeah, Michael Binyon, thank you very much indeed. Michael is, diplomatic correspondent at the Times. Great to have you with us.